Hello, excuse me. Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And let's start with U.S. foreign policy, which is causing a lot of harm around the world, and talk about Palestine and Ukraine. And in both cases, the Trump administration is basically adopting a pro-colonial policy by having the colonial power, Israel and Palestine, Russia and Ukraine, negotiate with the U.S. without the colonized, the Palestinians or the Ukrainians, present. This recent so-called peace agreement concerning Palestine has nothing about elections or statehood for Palestine. It projects Gaza being ruled by a so-called board of peace, chaired by Donald Trump and the British neoliberal war criminal Tony Blair on the board. Palestinians, they're going to appoint some technocratic Palestinians to run the place, but it won't be the Palestinians choosing who those technocrats are. And then in Ukraine, Trump still wants to partition Ukraine between him and Putin and force the Ukrainians to accept it. And that's what he tried to push on Zelensky at the meeting they had Friday a week ago. And Zelensky is willing to do a ceasefire at the current front lines, which is Trump's proposal now, and then negotiate a full peace settlement. But, then Trump said, well, he was going to meet with Putin in Budapest, which would have been this coming week. But Russia said again, they don't want a ceasefire. They don't want to stop firing until they have a settlement that addresses what they call the root causes. Well, the root causes for Russia are the very existence of Ukraine as an independent state and NATO in its current form. And so they talk about denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Denazification means regime change, getting a puppet in there. And demilitarization means Ukraine doesn't have the means to defend itself from Russian aggression and domination. And, Lavrov said it again last week. He said Russia cannot accept a ceasefire that leaves what he called a Nazi regime in control of Ukraine. So there's no real peace settlement on the horizon. And then there's a more ambitious root cause for Russia. They want NATO to retreat to its military footprint that it had in 1990 when Germany reunified. That was in the treaties that Russia demanded in December 2021 or else, as troops amassed outside Ukraine ready to invade. And then they invaded because the US and NATO didn't accept those demands. NATO is sometimes Russia's public excuse for invading Ukraine, but NATO didn't provoke Russia in 2021. The last countries to join NATO on Russia's borders, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, did so in 2004, until Finland joined after the full-scale invasion, because Russia scared the hell out of them. So they wanted allies for protection. And even in that period, the US, France, and Germany in particular were clear that Ukraine could not become part of NATO while it was still fighting the Russian invasion that began in 2014. And those NATO powers just didn't want to be responsible for defending Ukraine with their own forces under Article 5 of NATO, which is, an attack on one is an attack on all. All they were willing to do is send or sell weapons to Ukraine for its self-defense. But it was Ukraine that would have to fight, and they wouldn't come into NATO. So it wasn't NATO that provoked Putin. It was the pro-democracy revolution of dignity in 2014. That's what provoked Putin to invade in 2014. Putin was afraid democracy would spread to Russia. And I think that's the real root cause. And now Trump announced, because Putin wouldn't agree to Trump's peace proposal of a ceasefire on the current battle line, But it's a farce. Trump's sanctions won't go into effect for a month. That's November 21st. And they're really optional. If you read the language, the sanctions say may, not shall, leaving enforcement at Trump's discretion. And of course, we know who Trump is. He's Taco. Trump always chickens out. We've seen this before. Trump threatened sanctions, and the week before last, even Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine. And then Putin calls Trump, and we get Taco again. And he says, we're going to Budapest to meet with Putin. But Putin, having delayed everything and stopped everything, says, well, I'm not ready to meet. So they say no to a ceasefire. Trump cancels the meeting and says he will impose sanctions. But I think he's going to give us another taco, if past as any prologue. And let's put in the chat an analysis of why the sanctions are a farce from Phillips O'Brien. That'll, give you more background on why this is, Trump, basically lying again. And then meanwhile, in Palestine, the first phase of the agreement, a ceasefire, has already been broken bigly by the Israelis. Bigly, like the orange idiot sitting in what's left of the White House. That's what he would say. Israel's still killing Palestinians in Gaza. Food, water, and medical supplies are only trickling in because Israel, which still controls the border crossings, still want Palestinians to starve. And Hamas is not disarming. So the second phase of this so-called agreement, the International Stabilization Force, is not going to go in. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire between Israel and Hamas. So it's hard to see how this is going to go any further and is going to last. And meanwhile, the agreement says nothing about the West Bank, where Israeli settlers and the IDF are stealing Palestinian land and property and killing Palestinians without legal consequence. Which means for us, we got to keep building support for an arms embargo of Israel by the U.S. It's the U.S. that has the leverage on Israel. It's been providing military support and diplomatic cover for Israel for decades, and it does have the leverage. We saw this when Trump told Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire or lose U.S. support. So we got this tentative agreement that's probably not going to last. So if it's the U.S. that is needed to force Israel to begin to recognize Palestinian rights and come to a political solution to the problem there, that means, because the U.S. is backing Israel so much, to get regime change in Israel and Palestine, we need regime change in the U.S. And so we have a lot to do in that regard, but we can right now keep building support for an arms embargo of Israel. And then we got Venezuela. And the Trump administration officials are murderers. And they're saying it openly. They've blown up 10 boats now in both the Caribbean and Pacific Oceans, killed over 40 people. Now, if the boats are running drugs, the U.S. Coast Guard, this is what it used to do, would stop them, search them for drugs, and if they found contraband, arrest the people running that boat. But that's not what they're doing. They're doing summary executions without due process. And, unfortunately, this is not just a thing with Trump. President Obama used to order the murder of suspected terrorists without any due process. He had meetings on, they called them Terror Tuesdays, where he personally approved drone strikes and targeting killings of suspected terrorists on a secret kill list. And he even leaked this to the New York Times during his election campaign against Mitt Romney in 2012 to show how tough he was. And, where were the damn Democrats when that was happening? Some of them are not complaining about Trump, but you have the Obama precedent. And, Trump hasn't invoked that, but I'm sure he knows about it. So now we got Trump saying, this is a quote, "I don't think we are going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people." And this is, excuse me, this is after the Trump administration announced, it's not a covert operation, that the CIA is planning regime change in Venezuela. Yesterday, it announced it's sending an aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, that will arrive in a week or 10 days. This aircraft carrier has 5,000 Marines and 75 warplanes. This is at least a show of force, but it's looking more and more like Trump is going to intervene to overthrow the Maduro regime. And that will be a mess. It's just going to create civil war chaos and more mass immigration from a country that has already lost 8 million people, 20% of its population, because of growing poverty and repression. And if the U.S. goes in and tries to prop up a proxy government in Venezuela, it's going to be a long-term occupation and a counterinsurgency war like it was in Iraq. And if the U.S. just smashes the government militarily and then walks away, it's going to be a failed state and still a civil war to see who gets power, like it's been in Libya. So this is not going to be good for anybody. Our political comrades in the pro-democracy, socialist, and ecological left in Venezuela do want to replace the Maduro regime. They see it as pro-capitalist, authoritarian, suppressing the left parties that are to the left of the United Party. What do they call it? The United Socialist Party, I guess, in Venezuela. I mean, they've taken ballot lines from these left parties, denied them to get on the ballot. The radical left is very upset with Maduro, but they also vehemently oppose U.S. intervention. They want to change the government themselves. And, they got to fight Maduro for their democratic rights. They know Maduro lost the election in 2024. His government won't produce the precinct results that can be cross-checked and verified that the vote took place. And that's what the left presidents, progressive presidents in South America, Petro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil, Boric in Chile, they don't recognize Maduro's election. So the Venezuelan left is opposed to the corrupt crony capitalism of Maduro and his capitalist allies, but they want to move Venezuela in a more democratic, socialist, and ecological direction themselves. And I'll just mention here, there's finally a Green in the National Assembly in Venezuela, got elected first, I think, in 2022. His name is Alejandro Aguilar. And Venezuela does have proportional representation, but the opposition, which is, the right opposition, and also the left, they've called so many boycotts of some of these elections that it's been hard to get any representation in that parliament. But we do have a Green there. Now, what does that all mean for us here at home? When Trump kills people in boats in the Caribbean and Pacific Oceans, he's trying to normalize the killing of anyone he doesn't like. Trump is dehumanizing his opponents. He and his MAGA mouthpieces call the Democrats the lunatic left, communists, pro-Hamas, and all this nonsense. They call the No King's Day demonstrations or demonstrators people who hate America and support Hamas terrorists. They're calling those who dissent and protest domestic terrorists, like they call the boat people they've killed, narco-terrorists. So he's talking about us. It's not just the Democrats. Of course, it's people further left. And meanwhile, Trump is sending his paramilitary thugs in ICE and the Border Patrol, as well as regular military units into our cities. And they are doing profiling to detain Black and brown people based on how they look, not whether they did anything wrong. They're even arresting citizens first and asking questions later about their status. ICE has shot and killed at least 2 people in the streets of Chicago in the last 2 months. 2 dozen more have died in ICE concentration camps since Trump came back in. And there's no reason to believe that the Trump MAGA fascists won't start turning their guns in their concentration camps on those of us who express dissent and protest. So that's all the more reason we should be raising our voices. We shouldn't be intimidated and taking action. And we need to do that now before this repression becomes normalized, fascism becomes entrenched, and our progressive pro-democracy movements have to begin organizing underground instead of publicly. That's where the trajectory is headed. And if we don't speak up and act now, that's what we're going to be facing. So I'm interested in what you have to say. So put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll talk about what the next steps are. I don't know if this got in the chat, because I had a couple other links. We got we got none of them in the chat. So let's get the Phillips O'Brien piece on why the sanctions on Russia are a farce. I got a New York Times article from 2012 when the Obama administration linked about their Terror Tuesdays and, Obama ordering these killings. And then a couple things on Venezuela. One's a website called Venezuelan Voices, which is articles from the Venezuelan Democratic radical left. And the other is an article, an interview with Edgardo Lander that appeared in Tempest. And yeah, there it is. Venezuela's authoritarian turn and the repression of its left. Because, there's a lot of people think Maduro is still on the left, but that whole post-Chavez government has moved sharply to the right, and a lot of corruption and, basically making peace with the capitalists, both foreign and domestic. And that's the left's critique, along with the repression of their ability even to get on the ballot, which we as Greens know we face here. So those are getting in the chat. So let's look to see what your questions and comments are. Scout 164. Any thoughts on the controversy with Plattner's tattoo? I'm not sure what to think of it because his current policies don't align with what he probably thought before, and he regrets it. Yeah, my impression is those tattoos don't represent his politics today. But it's going to be a problem for him. And of course, his opponents are going to make a big deal out of it. The people of Maine are going to make a judgment on that. I just, he should have got those tattoos removed before he decided to run for the U.S. Senate. It's, it's the first thing he's ever run for. I don't know much about the guy, but I'm always skeptical of people that start at the top instead of, getting involved at the local level and, showing that they can be responsible and effective in advancing their policies. So I'm more interested in, particularly the Greens, let's get more people at the local level and go from there to state legislatures, build a base, get credibility, and then go for the U.S. House and get some leverage in national politics that way. I don't think there's a shortcut around that. I know people are going to be running for Congress and running for governor. I mean, one of my critiques of the Mamdani campaign is he's going to get in office, but not in power, because he doesn't even have the New York City Council with him. The progressives don't control it, and the Progressive Caucus, which is about a third of the councilors, is not that progressive. So he's going to be trapped by the Democratic Party in which he's operating, along with the larger capitalist structure. And until you got that legislative power and a social movement behind it, how are you going to take on the real power structure that sits behind the government in the form of, the capitalist class and their ability to, move assets around, wreck the local economy if they don't like who's running it, and, discredit them and then come back and put their own person in power. So I think we need to be building power local from the bottom up on the legislative side. And then when we've got near majorities or majorities in legislative bodies, then go for the executive office so you can carry through your policies. If you get in office, executive office in particular, but don't have the power to implement your policies because you don't have the legislative branch with you, and you don't have a movement that's ready to counter the direct action of the capitalists with their own direct action, what's the point? I mean, you get in office but not in power. You got a title but not the ability to implement your program. So anyway, I think Plattner, I'm just skeptical of him because the first thing he does when he goes political is run for the U.S. Senate. Scout 164. Gunn, in response to the generals of the U.S. military slowly getting disgusted with Pete Hegseth. I think there was something from the Washington Post or so that read about it. Yeah, I could have mentioned in my opening dialogue that another bad sign is that a lot of these top military officers, generals and admirals, are resigning because they don't want to do what Trump's asking them to do. The most high-profile example is the commander of Southcom, which controls U.S. military activities in South America and the Caribbean. And the reporting is, he hadn't said this publicly, but, people around him and, the reporters are getting messages from those people that he didn't like these, summary executions of people on boats, some of whom may have just been fishermen, or they may have been migrants. There's, no evidence they had drugs. They blew it up. And then when they caught two of them that survived the bombing, they didn't arrest them for drug trafficking. They sent them back to their respective countries. One was Ecuador, the other, I think, was Colombia. So this is basically Trump testing the waters about what he can get away with and kill who he wants, like he's some mafia don without any law enforcement there to put any check on him. Another thing to point out is these generals are concerned and officers are concerned that although Trump has immunity that the Supreme Court gave him for any damn thing he does as an official act, the officers that carry out these orders, they can be liable for war crimes. So Trump may get off scot-free, but the people that executed his orders may be liable, under international law, and they are concerned about that. Scout 164, I think it's bad that these guys are resigning. An interviewed veteran suggested they stay so that when they're ordered to do something bad, they could not do it and then lie that it was done. Huh. Some of that happened in Vietnam. These units would go out, and the second lieutenant knew that the rank and file might turn their guns on him if they didn't go out and pretend they did what they were supposed to do. And they just go out in the jungle and sit around and then come back and say they tried to do what they were ordered to do, but didn't. Basically, the reason Nixon had the Vietnamese to war, which meant we advise and arm South Vietnamese army instead of doing the fighting ourselves, was that our army didn't want to fight. Didn't want to fight that war. And so they weren't carrying out orders. They were sometimes even killing officers that tried to force them to do it. So the other thing they can do is refuse to do the order and say it's illegal and get it, caught up in the military justice or the broader federal court system. But that's a difficult road to take because it takes a lot of legal resources. It takes money. Where are they going to get it? So if they're resigning, the resignations could be more public. They could be expressing their dissent now that they've retired or resigned. Um, and that may come. We'll see. What do you think about artificial intelligence and the use of the water? Well, it's a big concern. I should maybe bring this up in a future podcast, but Amory Lovins has done a deep dive on the amount of energy that would actually take to do AI, and he's very skeptical of the claims that we're going to need all this energy. Amory Lovins is, if you're not familiar with him, he's been doing energy analysis since the 70s, and very strong proponent of renewable energy, anti-nuclear, and strong for efficiency and conservation of the energy we are using. Um, and I read his piece, and so I'm skeptical about AI. Now, the water, yeah, to cool these um, data centers, is an issue. And so, as I pointed out on a podcast, I referenced a website called Pause AI. You can look that up and see some of the arguments, but I think it's a real concern. And water, we've got a huge water crisis in the world. Aquifers are being drained to pump out water for agriculture and urban use. And that water could be used much more efficiently. It could be recycled through a water treatment system. There's a lot we got to do on that, and that creates a crisis of agriculture as well as just basic health. So I think we need to pause AI and really understand its ramifications and how to use it without it, taking over or destroying the environment. Joanna Munley, I just voted today in local election and am concerned about election integrity in the midterms. Any thoughts on this? Yeah, I think we do have good reason to be concerned. We've got the Republicans initiating and the Democrats copying the redistricting mid census cycle, which is unprecedented. The Republicans expect, the last number I saw was, they think they can gain 19 Republican majority seats by redrawing the district lands, blatant political gerrymandering, which will also have a racial consequence because majority minority districts will be diluted. And so you're going to have a much wider, Congress, and that is a big concern. And then, with these troops going in, there's been talk going back to the first Trump administration of invoking the Insurrection Act, creating an emergency. Remember, Trump wanted to seize or one of his lawyers was calling for the seizure of all the election machines from 2020. Trump wants to win this election any way he can, even if it's crooked. And so I think we need to be concerned, and we've got to, protect our elections. And, that means, starting at the local level. And I think, I'm in New York, and I know my local election board is pretty up and up. They wouldn't, fix an election. And I've seen how they do it. And they got, it's a hand ballot, and then it's counted by machines, that just scan the ballots. And then they do a spot check to make sure the scanning machines were working. And if there's a real close election, they do a hand count of the paper ballots. So I think that's pretty honest, but not every county in New York or every state has those kind of procedures or follows them effectively. So it's a big concern. And, the Trump MAGA people are trying to create a a permanent Republican majority, which is a fascist majority. So we'll have elections like Russia has elections, where it's, the result ahead of time. It's rigged. And that's something we've got to stay on top of. And then as far as the, political gerrymandering, we got a solution for that. It's proportional representation. And I pointed this out. I put the bill in the chat in previous podcasts. We got to support the Fair Representation Act, which would create proportional representation in the House and at least have the senators elected by ranked choice voting. If we had that proportional representation, the district lines won't matter or won't matter much because you can't create narrow majorities for your party across all the districts with proportional representation. The result is, proportional to the vote that every candidate's or every party's candidates gets. And if we had that, we could probably get some Greens elected to the House a lot sooner than with the winner-take-all system. So I think we got to be pushing proportional representation as this discussion about redistricting goes on and educate more and more people about it. I actually heard Jim Clyburn talk about it this morning on MSNBC. He's got a new book coming out about the 8 Black members of Congress that preceded him from, maybe it was South Carolina, maybe it's the South. And he talked about how both cumulative voting and proportional voting have been remedies for proven discrimination under the Voting Rights Act. And, I kind of was half listening and caught it as I realized what he's talking about. My immediate question is, well, if he thinks that, why the hell isn't he a co-sponsor of the Fair Representation Act? And if anybody's down there in South Carolina in his district, you should ask him that. But that's what we got to be doing with our members of Congress and in public, with the public, to make them aware that, if we had proportional representation, it'd make it much harder to rig the election with political gerrymandering, which is what the Republicans are doing now. And the Democrats are doing in response in the states where they got the majority, which is, defensive, maybe even justifiable in the circumstances, but, why aren't the Democrats calling for proportional representation? I think we know the answer to that. They know they'd lose some. The Greens would start getting elected, and the Democrats would no longer be able to take their left for granted, which is the majority of people on most economic class issues and even social issues, if you look at the polling. So the Democrats won't get behind it. Most of them won't because they're afraid of the Greens or an independent progressive party. So that's another thing we should be working on, proportional representation. And when we get to ranked choice voting, we should be talking about proportional ranked choice voting for legislative offices. If it's single district ranked choice voting, we may get more votes in the first round, but we're not going to win many seats. In Australia, they have that. They have single member ranked choice voting for their House. And the House has 150 members. The Greens get 10 to 12% of the vote. They've been doing this for a decade, and they've got one member of the House. On the other hand, the Senate, which is proportional ranked choice voting, the Greens what do they got? Out of 76 senators, I think it is, they got 11 Greens, which is about 12% of the vote, which is what they deserved. So that's a living experiment that shows us why we shouldn't settle for single member district ranked choice voting for legislative seats, whether we're talking about city councils, town councils, the state legislature, or the U.S. Congress. We should be talking about proportional ranked choice voting. So you rank your choices in multi-member districts. And if it's a 5-member district, little more than you get 20% of the vote, you get a seat. A 3-member district could be 30%. If it's a 10-member district, it'd be 10%. That's what we need. So all the political viewpoints that are out in society are represented in legislative bodies. Waiting for the next question. Here it is, Scout 164. Trump just wants to have a war because he can get full power. We shouldn't, under any circumstances, let it happen. Yeah, I think he's caught in a contradiction. He says, he's the peace president, wants to doesn't, he's non-interventionist, doesn't start wars, but he's about to, which is a big contradiction that, is an easy thing to shoot down from our point of view. And yeah, we should be saying no war on Venezuela. And we can do that by also saying, the left in Venezuela has criticisms that we support, related to democracy and a socialist economy. Justice Fee, there's no one to vote for in New York City, like A, B, DSA, Z, Zoran sold out to nuclear. I didn't know that. Let's see, who A is Adams, B is not sure who they are. Z, I'm assuming, is Zoran Mamdani. If he's pro-nuclear, I got a big problem with that. In bed with Kathy Hochul, whom he opposed just the other month. DSA always ends up supporting corporate neoliberal Democrats, Republicans of the war on nuclear Wall Street, corruption, state-sponsored terrorism, all around. It's interesting, Citizen Action New York, which is associated with DSA, was among protesters at Kathy Hochul's nuclear industries meeting in Syracuse last month. Yeah, they were. I gave a little speech at that demonstration. Kathy Hochul's definitely pro-war. Justice V adds AOC and Bernie. I think we should draw and recognize political differences between people like Hochul, who's first of all, corrupt. Her husband's getting all kinds of insider benefits from the Buffalo Bills stadium being built with state subsidies. And Bernie and AOC are not the same as Kathy Hochul. Although I do know AOC is open, quote unquote, to nuclear power. She needs to be educated about that if she's educable. But I think, there are differences. I'm not sure who A and B are. DSA, AOC Bernie. Thanks, I got it. So the left, the progressive Democrats, I think you're basically right in that they're going to be in bed with Kathy Hochul because she has, the power to support or oppose the tax increases that Mamdani needs in New York City to implement his program of free childcare and free and fast buses. And Hochul's opposed to those things. The corporate Democrats in the state legislature are opposed to those tax hikes. And the tax hike it's a raise in incomes over $1 million a year. I think it's a 1% increase. It's not that much. And a little higher corporate income tax in New York City, not the whole state. And that would go to New York City's coffers. There's also a stock transfer tax, which raises upwards of $15 billion a year, which since the fiscal crisis in New York in the 70s has been rebated to the traders in the New York Stock Exchange automatically. And, that was to basically they kept that tax in place so that if New York continued to default on its bonds, they'd have the money to pay for it. But since that hasn't been the case, they've just been rebating that tax, which is still on the books. That tax should be kept by the state to provide for the people's needs. And it's a tiny, fraction of a percentage tax on transactions. It's a sales tax. We pay sales taxes on just about everything else. And this is lower than the regular sales tax. And there's so many transactions because of computerized trading. It generates all those billions of dollars. So there is money in the system to pay for these things. But the difference between AOC, Bernie, DSA, and Zoran Mamdani is that they want to raise taxes a little bit to pay for these social programs, and the corporate Democrats like Kathy Hochul don't. So I think we need to, recognize that, and more than trying to get AOC, Bernie, DSA, and well, the leaders of DSA and Zoran Mamdani to work with us, it's their followers, their base, who want these things. And if those people aren't delivering, then maybe the Greens are where they should be going. And the phrase in there, corporate neoliberal Democrats, Republicans of war, nuclear, Wall Street corruption, state-sponsored terrorism. I would say, yeah, corporate Democrats and the fascist Republicans are on the same page with respect to Wall Street corruption. They can't get a bill passed in Congress to stop insider trading by the members of Congress. State-sponsored terrorism and Israel-Palestine, yeah, both parties, at least the leaders of both parties, still support that. But we also have to recognize that, the last time the Senate voted on an embargo of offensive weapons to Israel, half the Democrats in the Senate, about a quarter of the whole Senate, voted for that. So I'm just saying, if we say it's Tweedledum or Tweedledee, people aren't going to believe that because they can see Trump. The difference between Trump and Biden, at least in rhetoric, is pretty clear. And in substance, there is a difference. So I think it's a mistake for us to say there's no difference, because then people look at us like we don't know what's going on in the world. Okay, Justice V says, Zoran Mamdani responded that nuclear is worth exploring at the last mayoral debate on Wednesday. Trying to remember if I saw that quote. If that's what he said, he needs an education, because nuclear is a waste of money. It creates a mess, in terms of long-lasting, very toxic radioactive waste. It creates the situation where you could have a catastrophic accident. I mean, it's the most unsuccessful industry in the industrial era. It can't operate without public subsidies. The insurance industry won't insure it because the costs of a catastrophic accident are too high. So they've got partial coverage through the Price-Anderson Act, federal coverage, federal government coverage. And I noticed a poll the other day. Public opinion on nuclear power has really shifted in favor of it by like 20 percentage points in the last few years. So that's another thing. I mean, the Greens were born out of the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s and 80s. And Justice Lee, she says, you're not voting for nuclear. Well, in the case of Zoran Mamdani, first of all, there's no independent leftists on the ballot in New York. So you're left with a choice between Cuomo and Mamdani. If it was me, I'd vote for Mamdani just to keep Cuomo. I'd have run against Cuomo 3 times, and he is bad news. And I wouldn't see it as a vote for nuclear. I'd see it as a vote for universal child care and fast and free buses. And if you're in rent-regulated apartment, a rent freeze. But that's me. Scott 164, if we want the U.S. to become better, we have to stop trying to kill people because they don't support capitalism. The Cold War, even though it ended 30 years ago, still lingers in old souls. Yeah, but I'm wondering, we're not attacking socialist countries, because I don't think there are any. All the countries of the world now, capitalism is universal. Maybe China. Some people would argue that's socialist. It does have a lot of state control, but to me, socialism, the first thing is it's a workers' democracy, and they don't have democracy in China. And it depends, their capitalist side depends on super exploitation of hundreds of millions of migrant laborers who come in from the rural areas, work in the industrial urban areas on the coast, but they don't have access to public services. They don't have access back in their home districts, the rural areas. So they are super exploited. And, so I don't see how you can call China socialist. So, what we have is inter-imperialist competition between capitalist states or blocks of states. And is it a Cold War? Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not a shooting war directly between the great powers, but they fight each other, all kinds of ways with trade policy and military aid to proxies and that kind of stuff. And that it's not a Cold War between two systems, the capitalist West and I would call it a bureaucratic authoritarian East that called itself communist. That was a different system, bureaucratic collectivism, or some people call it state capitalism. It was different than the market-oriented capitalism of the West. But that system's gone. There are capitalist countries have lots of state ownership and control, but the main principle is exploitation of labor. And ruling classes can use state enterprises to do that as well as private enterprises. So, Saudi Arabia can in no way be considered socialist, even though their oil industry is nominally state-owned. But, that state isn't a state of all the people. It's a state of the royal classes, the aristocracy in Saudi Arabia. So I think we're not killing people because they don't support capitalism. We're killing people because they are rival capitalists. Where we are, fighting, or we are killing people to control areas so that other capitalists don't control them. I think that's what Iraq was about. We wanted the oil. That may be what Venezuela's about. Venezuela, if you count all their dirty oil, their what do they call it? The oil that's like in Alberta. It's very heavy, needs a lot of refining. God, I'm blanking on the name. That's what Venezuela has a lot of. By some estimates, more than any country in the world. So, maybe that's why we want to, or Trump wants to, try to take Venezuela. So, and we're not killing people because they don't support capitalism. We're killing people because they're sitting on resources like oil that we want. And that is straight up imperialism. Vicky Gordon. China has a lot of surveillance and social scores. China is very totalitarian and authoritarian. Yep, I agree with you on that. It's certainly not a model of socialism. And those pseudo-socialist groups that say China is their model are giving socialism a bad reputation. It's the same problem we had when the Stalinists left, pointed to the old Soviet Union and said that's socialism. And most people said, well, if that's what socialism is, I want no part of it. And we're still dealing with that legacy. In this country, for sure, in East Europe, I mean, the democratic socialists there have a hard time even using the word socialist because people think they're talking about the old Soviet system, which, was very oppressive and repressive and exploitive. Scott 164, Howie, I need some advice. I'm hoping to get a home soon, but I read someone online suggesting to have a protest happen on Black Friday while the house I'm looking at gets repaired. I want to move into the house and live on my own, but I also need these items if there does come to pass a protest on Black Friday. I'll feel really bad because I support the cause. What advice can you give where I support the protest while still waiting out for sales on items I need for when I move into my new house. So Black Friday is a. Are we talking about the Black Friday day after Thanksgiving, where some people protest consumerism and corporations by not buying things on that Friday? You're talking about the No Kings protest. Okay, I'm not sure I'm getting the connection between the No Kings protest and not purchasing items for your home. Does No Kings have a thing about not buying things? Because I'm not aware of that. And I mean, one of the critiques I've been reading about No Kings is there were no demands, except, it was just anti-Trump, which was good, but Scout 164, someone suggested not buying items on that day because by giving no money to corporations, it would mean No Kings get money. Okay. So No Kings was last weekend. So I still don't see what the issue is with buying the items you need now. Someone, Vicky Corden, suggests you should buy only what you need. I think that's good advice. You don't want to, it's not just about giving money to corporations, it's about, husbanding your own resources. So Scott 164, the biggest weakness of Trump, which he's trying to make a strength, is he's not capable of ending wars. It's why he still looks foolish. Yeah, I think more and more people are seeing that, including people in his own base. They're, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's going to oppose, intervening in Venezuela, I think. Certainly Rand Paul is. So, yeah, it's a contradiction. And I think more and more of the people that voted for Trump see that. I wonder whether his hardcore base, which is maybe a third of the vote, is even thinking enough to see the contradiction. Any thought, this is Scout 164, any thoughts on MAGA being plan racist to cash? He wanted to support an Indian holiday only for MAGA to bash him. So the question is MAGA going to turn on him? It wouldn't surprise me, although he's been such a loyal soldier for Trump. I think Trump likes him running the FBI to kowtow to whatever Trump wants. But I'm not surprised that he's getting some problems from the MAGA racists. Scout 164. Artificial intelligence is the only reason the U.S. economy stays afloat, thanks to the effing tariff trade war Trump started. Do you know that that'll happen, or what'll happen once it inevitably bursts? Catastrophic damage for a century? Well, a century is a long time. I think there definitely is a stock market bubble in those 6 or 7 big tech stocks that are booming because people are anticipating a big payoff from AI. It reminds me of the .com boom in the late 90s. So a lot of people are going to lose money, and then if they lose money in the stock market, if they're wealthy people that might invest in other things, they won't. So it could cause a recession. I think that is going to come sooner or later, and the trade war isn't helping. So Trump may be setting himself up for a real economic crash, and that would be bad for us as just people that live in this economy, but we'll sort of get what's the word? You get some satisfaction from seeing Trump fall on his face. Beatty Dimmitt. My first notice of Kim Iverson was during the attacks on Venezuela that included the occupation of the embassy. Ajamu Baraka was in Venezuela at the time, sending info back that debunked the depiction of life there that we were receiving. My take home from that podcast was that Venezuela was going to comply with the U.S.-Saudi agreement about the petrodollar. As a side note, she also said that Venezuela had declined to allow BP, British Petroleum, to control the fossil fuel reserves of the economy. The Bank of dot, dot, dot. And Beatty goes on, in Trump's first term, he was saying things like, North Korea would be a good war for us. He clearly wants to be a war president. Yeah, I think it depends on the circumstances. Trump will say anything. Sometimes he's the peace president. We don't intervene. America first. And other times he wants to be a war president. I think he wants to be the center of attention and also, get good credit. Now, I think you're referring, Beatty, to 2020 when the U.S. was promoting Juan Guaido as the alternate to Maduro, and okay, Beatty says, I saw a Euro News segment the other day with someone saying the U.S. seems to be having success at bringing down the crime rate by sending the military into cities like LA and DC. Sorry, the Bank of England was denying Venezuelans access to the gold they were storing. Yeah, there have been economic sanctions against Venezuela, although Trump really ramped those up in 2019. And in 2020, half my campaign staff was in that Venezuelan embassy, sitting in to protect its takeover by the Guaido forces, who were just backed by the U.S. and they weren't legitimate in Venezuela. But the economy in Venezuela started crashing when the price of oil went down. The sanctions have made it worse, but there's a lot of problems with the management, I would say, by Maduro. So, and a lot of people were fleeing in exile because of the poverty and repression before the sanctions. The sanctions have made it worse. They should be lifted. And the sense I'm getting now is that Maduro basically offered to give Trump everything he wanted in terms of access of U.S. corporations to Venezuelan oil. Now, forget the Bank of England's excuse for holding on to Venezuelan gold that may be part of the sanctions. So, yeah, there's been economic warfare against Venezuela, and we should oppose that. The Venezuelans got to take care of the problems in Venezuela. U.S. military is not designed to do that. And you just go in and overthrow governments without the local people having a plan to replace them, you end up with a mess. And that's what we're headed for in Venezuela. Okay, our hour is up, and I think Venezuela is on people's minds for sure. And I think Trump's going to keep it there. So, we got to say no war on Venezuela, arms embargo on Israel, and above all, whatever we're working on, be out there public and don't be intimidated by the repression we're getting from Trump. And we got to build a, broad front. And a lot of those people won't agree with us on independent politics, but they do agree on, Trump has got to go. It has to be resisted. And so we should be part of that broader movement, bring our own perspective into it. So next week, I will have Artem Chape, who is a Ukrainian author, socialist, and now soldier, defending Ukraine from the Russian invasion. He has a book out. You can look at it. You can read it in an afternoon. It's a short book called "Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns," and it's a very moving article. It's really a long essay. The book is, him reflecting on. Here he is, someone who considered himself a pacifist. Now, taking up arms to defend his country. He comes from the radical left. He's the translator of Gandhi into Ukrainian, Noam Chomsky into Ukrainian, Edward Said into Ukrainian. But when the war broke out and Chomsky was saying NATO made Putin do it, Artem wrote a critique of Chomsky and directed it directly to him. It's and we'll talk about that next week. So anyway, I think he'll be a great guest to listen to, and so that'll be next week. And in the meantime, get out there and be active, and let's resist what's coming at us from the Trump regime.